WN winter season of the off season of being a baseball free agent, of being a eliminated Ravens fan, of being a Maryland Terps fan with a parking pass that's somewhere on the outside lots. And one thing that used to keep us warm around here in the early days of the Nestor radio administration here in Baltimore was discussions of Hall of Fames, past, present, and future, back in the 90s and the aughts, about who is in, who is out, who should be in, who shouldn't be out. And then the steroids came, and Pete Rose came, and Marvin Miller never came. And now we're at this point where it's not that big a discussion in baseball circles. However, it's still a pretty passionate discussion. Luke Jones is here to join me, and he's my favorite person to talk baseball with. And I'm going to give you the opportunity here on the eve of potentially Mike Mussina finally getting a call, perhaps Curt Schilling, certainly I would think Edgar Martinez, Rivera, some other guys. And also you can jump on the Harold Baines thing if you want, but happy Hall of Fame argument to you. Let's have one. Let's go for it.
Yeah, and I've said my piece on Harold Baines, and I want to make it very clear. Harold Baines was one of my favorite players growing up. I always respected him. My dad used to always joke that Harold Baines could hit out of a wheelchair, knowing how bad his knees were all the time, but still produced, but just not a Hall of Famer. But I digress on that. As we're getting down to the last few days before the announcement's made as far as the class of 2019, and I think you kind of start at the top and say Edgar Martinez looks like he breaks through in year 10, as he should. And I just mentioned I wasn't going to say anything about Harold Baines, but if Harold Baines is a Hall of Famer, Edgar Martinez absolutely is a Hall of Famer.
Dude, you know one of the things that kills me, and I could make the whole list of what the stupidity of this and write about it, but when you say, like, for the 10th year, as he should,
oh, sure.
And it becomes like, I remember driving with Phil Jackman on 295 back in the 80s to Caps playoff games, where they were always eliminated a series earlier than you thought they would, and, Jackman and I would have these kind of arguments all the time when I was a kid, and he was an elder statesman, still is an elder statesman, still listens in from time to time, as I understand. And we would make this argument about, I'm not putting him on my ballot this year. He's going to wait till next year. And I'm like, what kind of stupid idea is that when the stats don't change year to year? And I'll still say it 30 years later, whatever it is, I just don't understand any of the unwritten rules of the baseball. I don't understand the unwritten rules of baseball, but the Hall of Fame unwritten rules, when you write them down, they're really stupid, man. They don't make any sense.
Yeah. And, I mean, let's face it. I mean, there are things that we've talked about with football. So, I mean, none of these processes are perfect, but you're right. And for me, it's not even about having players on the ballot multiple years. I've actually come around on that idea because as we've gotten more sophisticated with advanced statistical analysis, I think a guy like Mike Mussina, who we'll get to in a few moments, his case becomes that much more clear-cut that he should be a Hall of Famer, whereas if you just kind of looked at it in the old traditional methods, even though he still had 270 wins and still had a high winning percentage and things of that nature that certainly help him from traditional measures standpoint, but I like the idea that you can really dig into some of these candidates. Now, that said, I'm with you from the standpoint of how we can't have a unanimous entry. I mean, this year the name that everyone's talked about is Mariano Rivera, which, look, Mariano Rivera is a first ballot Hall of Famer. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, I certainly can't get behind the idea that he's the guy that should become the 100% unanimous electee if Cal Ripken wasn't that, and Ken Griffey Jr. wasn't that, and name any of the all-time greats or the most revered players in the history of the game, and they didn't receive 100% of the vote because a long time ago it was determined that no one should be a unanimous electee, which is just one of those things where you sit back and say, why? But I think, beyond that, it's fun debate. I think as more time goes on and more writers and fans become more enlightened as far as more sophisticated ways to compare these players. I mean, we talk about this all the time, and I've said this to you a lot. I've talked about it a lot in the context of even talking about the Ravens defense now compared to the year 2000. and understanding that you have to really have a grasp on that era. I think we've always had this tendency to compare players, whether we're talking about Hall of Famers or just players across different eras. Think about Orioles players now compared to 10 years ago, compared to the 90s, compared to the 60s. We've always tried to compare just looking at ERA or the number of home runs they hit of a player, Brooks Robinson compared to Cal Ripken years later, when really the best way to compare players across eras is really to look at how that player did within his own era, how he stacked up compared to his contemporaries. And that's where you look at a guy like Mike Mussina and say, okay, his career ERA is 3.68. At first glance, that's clearly inferior to what Jim Palmer did in the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s. But when you consider the era in which Mike Mussina played and how he stacked up to his contemporaries, his profile is more closely resembles Jim Palmer than you would think when you think about adjusted ERA and different categories like that really take into account the run-scoring environment of that era, take into account the ballpark, take into account the fact that Mike Mussina pitched his entire career in the AL East, which is just an absolute crucible. I mean, it is the frying pan of pitchers in the 90s and the 2000s especially. I mean, that's difficult. So I think with us having a multi-year ballot, and it's gone from 15 to 10 now, it has allowed those who truly take this process seriously. It does provide ample time to study, and it's why someone like Tim Raines, who never thought he was a first ballot kind of Hall of Famer, but when you look at his profile and really look at how he stacked up, he ended up being a Hall of Famer, whereas 20 years ago, I think it would have been a pretty overwhelming, resounding no. So there's good with that and there's bad with that, and the process isn't perfect, and certainly you get into guys like Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds and Sammy Sosa and Manny Ramirez, and it's very, very frustrating, and I don't have a perfect answer for guys of that ilk. But when you're talking about guys like Edgar Martinez and Mike Mussina, as more time has gone on, I think it's become very clear that their candidacy, they're deserving of being in the Hall of Fame, and I fully expect Martinez to be in this year, and if Mussina isn't in this year, it's a matter of time at this point. I think the momentum is certainly there that Moose is going to be in Cooperstown sooner rather than later.
When you try to make a case for anyone who isn't the, automatic, shoe-in guy, you wind up finding the spots, right? Whether it's didn't win 300 games, didn't win a championship, didn't last long enough, didn't go long enough, didn't play the field, had bad knees, didn't get 3,000 hits, didn't have 500 home runs. Whatever those things are that don't make you Willie Mays, right? Or whatever that thing would be that would, earmark you for being a great player. In the case of Mussina, the things that have kept him out are still there too, right? And I guess the naysayers would say all of that. And I think that the Clemens and the Bonds and the steroidy guys and the guys that have been locked out, it has opened and lowered the bar for Harold Baines or lowered the bar for a lowly DH like Edgar Martinez, a guy who only every team in the American League would have wanted to have on their team at any point in his career, for any amount of money, you're still dealing with old and new and old thoughts and new thoughts about where the benchmarks are and where they need to be and where Jim Palmer would throw 18 complete games in a year, and, these guys get to the 5th or 6th inning, and I guess that'll come back when it's time for, I don't know, name your Sabathia or name your Verlander or, whomever the next category will be 10 years from now. But in the case of Mussina, I've always felt like, and the way I would view him or anybody else of his ilk, and this would go to Halladay, who I think has gotten a lot of points for being a nice guy and perishing early, that there's a sympathy vote that goes along with this too in some cases, or the opposite of sympathy, which is what Curt Schilling's going to get, which is you're a jerk and I don't want to vote for you. Same thing with Barry Bonds, amongst others. So you play the personalities into this as well. But in the case of Mussina, he was a guy that was always a frontline rotation guy who did it for over a decade, who always was facing the other team's ace, always pitched in the American League East, always had the toughest hitters, always put himself into the spot, didn't sign in, somewhere weird, and he signed in New York. He signed to play with the big boys, pitched in big games, pitched well in big games. I've often thought, did he piss off some sports writers in New York, or what happened, or did he keep too low a profile because he wasn't really all that interested in being a spokesperson for much of anything, other than maybe the Players Association at various points, or the game itself, and doing crossword puzzles in the corner and sort of being left alone coaching his high school basketball team the last 15 years. I've always been interested in the case against him, and to some degree the case against Schilling. Lately I get it because I read his work. I've seen his work, but before that I thought of them as 1 and 1A. I thought of them as kind of the same pitcher. For all of those years, I didn't want any part of either one of them, and if I had either one of them pitching, I felt really good about my chance winning. Never more one than the other in any way, and I sort of would put Glavine and Smoltz and Matt, other than their regular season accomplishments aside, if you gave me an October night and gave me a Game 7 and gave me any of those cats, I'd want to have the ball with them. And that means they're a Hall of Famer in my mind because they held up to all the rest of the scrutiny over 12, 15 years, other than a Pedro Martinez who didn't hold up. Much like a Terrell Davis in football or whatever, there's a longevity issue and how far you want to go. Mussina probably could have gone 5 more years and thrown a knuckleball and maybe won 13 to 15 more games, literally, and probably could have padded some money. He had kids. He had a lot of money. He went home. He could have stuck around a little longer if he wanted to.
Yeah, and I think that's what's one of the more interesting parts of his case, the overall body of work with him. He ended up winning 270 games. Of course, he didn't win 20 games until his final season with the Yankees, which, he'd kind of bounced back.
Well, he got boned out of one by Armando Benitez blowing a save.
Sure. Oh, no doubt.
Crazy stuff happened to him that if, when you look, he got hit in the skull, square up by a line drive. Canigliaro never came back ever. Lots of guys never come back. Lots of guys are never the same. He came back and got a $100 million contract, and there's a lot of real reasons to. If I got in the room for him, I would make a hell of a case for him, and I would for Schilling as well. And I pointed that out as much as I'm sideways in every single thought that almost I've seen him utter publicly. I would have made the case for him, and I still would as a pitcher. He deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. I'd make a case for Pete Rose too. So I just would because that's. And Marvin Miller and other people who've been blackballed. As a guy who is your partner who's been blackballed by the Orioles for 13 years, we're familiar with blackballing around here. I am the Colin Kaepernick of Baltimore sports journalists. So, I'm familiar with being blackballed and being thrown out for the wrong reasons when you've earned something. And I wouldn't do that to Schilling. I wouldn't do that to anyone. I feel like Schilling and Mussina were 1 and 1A. And if you're going to separate them, you didn't watch baseball. Because if you're going to separate them, Schilling was by far, you can make all those cases about October and pitching for the Phillies, and everywhere he went, they won, and he was a reason they won, and all the things that everybody hates about him is the reason you'd want him as the enforcer on your, all of that stuff, and they're going to lock him out. And he never got near a steroid, as far as I could tell. Probably a lot of nachos, but never, and some beer, but never steroids. Schilling.
Yeah, and just to touch on Schilling, and by the way, I agree with you on that. As far regardless of what he said post-career and political views and
he's a Hall of Famer.
That, I mean, at some point in time, we've got to acknowledge the greatness that was there. And you mentioned Mussina and Schilling being 1 and 1A. Mike Mussina's career WAR 83. Curt Schilling 79.6. So you're talking about very close. I think 23rd and 26th all-time in terms of starting pitchers in that metric. Now Schilling had his marquee moment in the 2004 postseason with the bloody sock, and of course he had some other great postseason performances. But even though Mussina didn't win a World Series, go look at his postseason numbers and then get back to me as far as whether he was a big game pitcher or not.
I was there. I witnessed it. I was there for those games. I was at Yankee Stadium when he was a Yankee. I was at Camden Yards in the Cleveland game that got away from Benitez. That probably was the World Series we could have, should have, would have won. That would have been our year.
Yeah, I mean, that's the 1 year, my lifetime of watching Orioles baseball, not counting when I was 2 weeks old when they won the World Series in '83. That '97 team,
They had the best team.
I was so convinced, and I was 14 at the time, so I was a little naive, certainly, but I was so convinced they had the best team in baseball that year, and they were going to win it, and they ran into the wrong team at the wrong time, and kind of like the Orioles against Kansas City in '14. Pretty similar there's quite a comparison to be made there, but you can't fault what Mussina did in that series. I mean, he was absolutely terrific. They didn't score runs for him. I mean, ultimately, and that's where I kind of get into the wins and some of those measures where you say, okay, Mike Mussina only won 20 games once, but to your point, could have won in '96, would have won 20 games in '95 had it not been for a strike-shortened season. He had 16 wins in '94 when they closed up shop in mid-August. I mean, he would have won 20 games that year, barring an injury. So you start to really, and this is where I said I like the fact that you don't just have a 1 year yes or no on these guys, because you would really miss out on some really compelling cases. But I think Mike Mussina is the type, if you really study how he did and understand the context of the era in which he played, the division in which he pitched, and take a look at that era, and you can make an argument. Now, he's not in the Hall of Fame right now, and I don't know if he ever will be one day, but Mike Mussina pitched in the same era as Roger Clemens, Randy Johnson, Greg Maddux, Pedro Martinez. No, those first three I mentioned, absolutely, you can make arguments. 3 of the 10 best pitchers in Major League history, at least make that argument. And Pedro Martinez is in that one of the best peaks in Major League history, that argument. So Mike Mussina pitched in an era with some, not just Hall of Fame pitchers, but some all-time best Hall of Fame pitchers. And
who did it against some of the best hitting that's ever been recorded statistically, where everybody's hitting like they're in Colorado, for crying out loud.
Right. So that's where you really start to break this down and peel back some of the layers, and you realize how strong his candidacy is. Look, I have no problem with Mike Mussina ending up not being a first ballot Hall of Famer, as much as we just, at the beginning of our conversation, we kind of said that notion is silly, but that's still a reality in what Hall of Fame voting is. I'm fine with the fact that he may not have been elected in his first year, but he certainly is worthy. And you kind of go through the list. You mentioned this. He could have hung on for 2 or 3 more years, and he would have gotten to 300 wins. He was 30 wins away. I think he had a very practical, realistic chance that if he wanted to pitch until he was 41 or 42, and the fact that he threw 200 innings in his final season suggested that could have been realistic. Certainly if he had, whether it had been with the Yankees or if he had caught on with another successful team to be their number 4 or number 5 starter, Mike Mussina could have gotten to 300 wins. And then he would have been a first ballot then, right? I mean, we talk about these benchmark statistics, even though we're at a point now where we're not going to see any more 300-game winners. It's just the nature of the beast and what baseball's become. But you kind of look at some of those other statistics, though. 270 wins, 24th among modern pitchers, a .638 winning percentage. I think that's 10th out of the 97 or 98 200-game winners.
And he pitched on some Oriole teams.
Yeah, exactly, although he pitched on some good Orioles teams as well. But his league-adjusted ERA is right up there with some of the all-time best pitchers, when you really take into account the run-scoring environment and era in which he pitched. So you look at those numbers, you look at his career WAR, I think he's 23rd all-time in WAR among pitchers in baseball history. I mean, everything about his candidacy checks the boxes other than the fact that he didn't have that Cy Young Award-winning season. He didn't win a World Series if you put stock into that for an individual player. He only had 1 20-win season, although we said that he easily could have had 3 or 4. It stacks up. But the one thing you can say about Mike Mussina, he was never the best pitcher in the league at any specific point, but he was in the top 5 in the league for a long period of time. and he was in the top 10 in the league for virtually his entire career, save for a couple seasons. So, no, he was never the absolute best at what he did at any given point, but he was up there for a really long time, and maybe he didn't have that same peak that a lot of Hall of Famers have, but he was just so consistently really, really good for a long period of time. And I know some people will say, well, that means he's Hall of Very Good, right? Well, at some point in time, there is a line of demarcation where
I keep thinking to myself, they're putting Harold Baines in. Harold Baines played alongside Mike Mussina.
Yeah.
There was never a point where I walked in there and thought one of those guys was going to the Hall of Fame and one of them wasn't. I mean,
right. And again, I'm struggling with picking on Harold Baines too much.
I love Harold Baines. I'm picking on the people who picked this, who've lowered the bar, who have sort of, in so many ways over the course of my lifetime. And, I said this to Justin McGuire the other day, and I take pride in my family's baseball background and my last name. I don't trade on it, although when I'm in the airport in Chicago, it's nice. But other than that, Luis would not get in the Hall of Fame, right? Like, if in the modern era, he would not have those kind of numbers. I've taken the thing seriously. I've done shows from there. I go up there. I remember riding up there with Ripken, which now seems like eons ago, and it's now 12 years ago. The only thing we have going for us at this point is Mussina, and I guess whenever Machado will show up, and there's always that question is whether Mussina's going to wear a Yankee hat or an Oriole hat, and there's a lot of statistical evidence that says he was a better Oriole than he was a Yankee.
Sure.
So all of that will come up next week, but I don't think I've ever said this, and maybe I've said this to his brother because Mark comes on 3-4 times a year, and I hope to have him on in the aftermath of all this. I hope he gets in. I mean, I drank a lot of beer with Mike back in the day, and we had a lot of fun together. We're the same age, and he was one of my favorite people in a lot of ways, and very, very smart, very, very humble in his own way, and didn't like all the fuss and muss and liked to be above the fray. I don't think it's affected his life. I don't think he's up all night, maybe the way Rafael Palmeiro is, probably eating up about it. You know what I mean? And I don't think he's up all night eating up about not having a ring. I think it's, I played, I did my thing. I gave it my best shot, and when it was time to come home with my kids, I didn't feel like hanging on to make money I wasn't going to spend. You know what I mean? Like, literally. And I think he pursued it as such, and I think it would be a real doff of the cap for him to get in on his own terms and not go chasing a 3 with 2 eggs at the end of it the way other people chase these numbers to sort of punch their ticket and then not get it punched, literally, right?
Sure. And I think what you said, it really speaks to why so many people liked him. As far as here in Baltimore, certainly in the Bronx, I mean, he did his job, and there was little flash about it. And I mean, he could be abrasive and not wasn't going to go out of his way to give you the most fantastic quote if you asked a dumb question.
You know what, man? He loves smart people, and if you were smart, Mike Mussina had time for you because you were in his space saying and thinking smart things. And I saw it every day he was here. I saw it when he left. I don't stay in touch with him. I don't think he has a huge center of baseball around him. He has his community. He always had his community. It was always home to him. He's the same dude, much like another guy that you and I got to know that we're about to say goodbye to here, who leaves very underappreciated off the side of the bench and who may or may not have an afterlife and who could always pull his ring out and his money out and his family out as leading with that. In no unsubstantial way, and Joe Flacco. The time I spent with Joe Flacco, privately, when it was just me and Joe, and that happened a lot, over the 10 years where I'm in his pickup truck and we're in Philadelphia riding around. He channeled Mike Mussina. And I would tell Mark that all the time, that there were real similarities, that Joe doesn't care about the Hall of Fame or this or that. Joe cares about this week's game plan and how to make the trains run on time. And I think Mussina was the same way. And I think if this happens for him, great. If it doesn't, that's cool. I think he's deserving. I think deep down he thinks he's deserving. I think deep down most people around him feel like he's deserving. And I think it's it's a sham of the institution that they make these people twist like this. You know, I mean, I do.
Yeah, but I would also say in defense of the institution, a lot of the standards that we used to use and only have those, and we didn't talk about WAR and league-adjusted ERA and things of that nature. His candidacy doesn't look quite as strong without taking into account those things. I think in Mussina's case, having a longer period of time to evaluate has helped his candidacy, because I think those who are enlightened about it and really understand how we should evaluate players across different generations. And I want to be very clear about this, you know, because we spent a couple minutes picking on the selection of Harold Baines. The Hall of Fame has always made bad decisions across generations. You can go back and find players that were elected in the 40s and the 50s. There was a push to elect players from the 19th century that, I mean, it was all who was a buddy, who was a family friend of this specific person, this voter.
We're going to get him in. We're going to get him in.
Yeah,
he should get himself in. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but you can go back and you can find plenty of that. So as much as it's so in your face with what to do with the PED generation of players, it's been problematic all along. I mean, what's funny, and I believe, I want to say it might have been Joe Poznanski wrote about Mussina last year, right around this time, and he just kind of talked about it in general terms, and he mentioned right off the bat, why is Gaylord Perry in the Hall of Fame? I mean, we've taken such a strong stand against PED users in the Hall, and look, if people want to take that stand, that's fine, but we take that stand, yet it's all slaps on the back and laughing about what Gaylord Perry did, who openly admitted to doctoring the ball his whole career. You know, I mean, like, we kind of pick and choose what we're going to say is okay and what isn't, and I don't know. That strikes me as funny, but bringing it back to Mussina, I think it's very clear at this point it's a matter of when and not if, whereas a couple years ago I wasn't so sure about that. And even if you look at some of these sites that do some of the live up-to-date ballots that voters that have revealed their ballots and they kind of track it in live results, it's looking like Mussina has a chance for it to be this year. Edgar Martinez is definitely going to get in. Mariano Rivera is definitely going to get in. And then I think, Halliday's a little more interesting, although I expect him to get in. Mussina, whether it's this year or next year or at the latest 2 years from now, he's going to be in. But you look at some of the early voting results that, where some of these voters who make their ballots public, which I like.
Yeah, that guy follows it out online, and people retweet him, and 44% of the ballots are in, and
Yeah, which and obviously there's going to be some people, especially people who are trying to make some kind of statement. I mean, we've had some voters turn in a blank ballot or do different kind of kooky stuff over the last however many years. So you're going to have some of that, and that's going to skew some of the numbers, but it's trending the right way for Mike Mussina, especially considering he's got a few more shots at this. He's going to get in, and that's the right outcome. He is deserving. Again, you can kind of say, well, he wasn't Roger Clemens, he wasn't Randy Johnson, he wasn't Pedro Martinez. You know what? There are a ton of pitchers in the Hall of Fame you could say the same exact thing about. So maybe he was only the fifth best pitcher of his generation, or sixth best pitcher of his generation. But for as much as we've talked about home runs and PEDs and the run scoring environment that was the 90s and the early 2000s, there were a lot of great pitchers in that era of baseball. And Mike Mussina, maybe he's the next tier down from Maddox and Randy Johnson and Pedro, but.
By the way, it's really interesting on this ballot, just seeing the guys that aren't in. There's Schilling and Clemens, and then there's a long drop-off to, like, Billy Wagner, who's never getting in. And other than that, it really is just a bunch of position players beyond Rivera and Halliday at the top, who we've already said are going to get in. We believe Mussina's going to get in. But you either are or aren't, right? As opposed to some of this. How is Omar Vizquel getting votes? You know what I mean? Like Scott Rowland.
Omar Vizquel, I think people, even though I disagree with this.
Andrew Jones. I mean, these guys weren't Hall of Fame players, man,
But you know what? if you look at Rolen and Andrew Jones, and look, I tend to agree with you on that. I would say no on those guys, but at the same time,
how does 1 in 5 baseball fans look at Omar Vizquel and say he's a Hall of Famer? How do you do that?
Because they view him in the same context as Ozzie Smith, even though a lot of the fielding metrics say that he wasn't as great as Ozzie Smith. As great as Omar Vizquel was defensively, he wasn't that great defensively to put him in Ozzie Smith's category. But that's why, and it's strange. Put it this way, I would have far more support for Andrew Jones and Scott Rowland than I would Omar Vizquel for the Hall of Fame. And I think another interesting name, and it looks like he's kind of getting a boost with some of the live balloting that's been out there. Larry Walker's another one that you kind of look at the numbers, and I get it that he played at Coors Field, but you still look at those numbers and say, and the fact that he was good defensively, he was a good base runner, even if he wasn't a fast base stealer, all of the numbers suggest Larry Walker should be getting way more support than he's gotten to this point in his Hall of Fame.
Well, he's also a guy that was thought to be clean, and we all, we go through every one of these guys. Mussina, clean. Schilling, beer.
Even though we really have no idea, right?
We have no idea. We just point at these guys.
That's why I kind of just laugh at that whole notion. And look, you saying it, you're right. People do that all the time. It's why Jeff Bagwell had to wait as long as he did. I mean, Bagwell's numbers said that was a slam dunk, but he had to wait because there was speculation about him, and same with Piazza. I don't have the perfect answer for that. And in the same way, I don't have the perfect answer for Clemens and Bonds, who are two of the all-time best players in the history of the game, and were already trending in that direction long before they were suspected of steroid use. But I don't have that answer, so people are going to vote on those guys the way that they're going to. But in the meantime, I'm glad to see Edgar Martinez looking like he's going to get in, because I think DH is a position, and if you are truly great at it, knowing that you have to be the best of the best at that spot, because your defense isn't helping you, even though he was a pretty decent third baseman early in his career before the injuries. But you know that there's nothing, you're not getting any tiebreaker from a defensive standpoint, so you need to be the best of the best. Well, Edgar Martinez was the best of the best when it came to the designated hitter spot over the last 40 years. And looking at a guy like Mussina, okay, he wasn't Clemens, he wasn't Randy Johnson, he wasn't Pedro Martinez from a peak standpoint, but all he did was be one of the absolute best pitchers in the game, in that top 5, top 6 territory for close to 2 decades. I mean, for 16, 17 years, he was in that range, and that's saying something to be able to do that and to put up the numbers that he did, and even his strikeout numbers. Prior to his era, strikeouts, save for a few exceptions like Nolan Ryan, you didn't see strikeouts like you've seen from the mid-'90s on. And certainly today, all we talk about is velocity and missing bats and strikeout numbers. But, his strikeout numbers are pretty favorable as well. And we haven't mentioned this yet, but Mike Mussina, also a great fielder of his position.
And could hit too. If he had been in National League, if he had signed with the Braves or whatever and had to go hit, 60 times a year, 80 times a year, he'd have been okay, man.
Yeah, he would have gotten a few hits from time to time and wouldn't have embarrassed himself. But 7
he
Gold
might have batted
Gloves,
217 or something.
yeah. But 7 Gold Gloves, 5 All-Star games, plenty of top 5 finishes in Cy Young. And I get it; it's top 5. It's not winning it. I understand that. If you're going to make an argument on his best peak, it is lacking compared to some other Hall of Famers. But his entire body of work, it exceeds many, many Hall of Famers that are already in Cooperstown. So it's a matter of when, not if, for Mike Mussina at this point. And I'm glad about that because he's definitely deserving. And I like the comparison you made with Joe Flacco. I mean, Mussina's body of work and statistics and all that far exceeds what Joe Flacco's done in his career
so
field.
But
personality-wise, I think that's a pretty good comparison. I think, two guys who did their job, weren't necessarily looking for over-the-top accolades, and tried to do their best to help their team win. And then they went home and spent time with their family, and didn't want to be bothered too much after that. And there's something really admirable about that at the end of the day.
Well, all these years later, there's also something admirable about the fact that Mike Mussina batted .273 in 1999 in his 11 Ikes in interleague play, and he only had 52 lifetime at-bats, and he batted .173 overall. So he was only getting 5 at-bats, 7 at-bats a year in the American League, but never hit a home run, only hit 1 double, but lots of singles mixed in there. So there, you're gonna make the case.
I can remember his first career hit in '97. They were down in Atlanta,
yeah,
and was it Smoltz pitching? I want to say, I could be wrong about that, but it was against Atlanta. Hit an absolute rocket off the pitcher's glove, and I think it was Smoltz. It may have been Maddox. I can't remember.
See, I knew Mike real well back then. He started talking poop about that 3 weeks out, and he had the calendar out, and he was like, hey, I might get the bat, and he always he was offered a scholarship at Penn State by Paterno to kick, right?
Yeah, he was a phenomenal
athlete.
He's a
legendary guy, right?
No doubt about it. Basketball, football, But I remember that first hit. It was a rope off the pitcher's glove for an infield single. He could. For a pitcher, that's always the caveat. He might have, if he had been in the National League, he probably would have hit fairly well for a pitcher, and that just, a very small part of it. But it just adds to what was in my mind, very much a deserving Hall of Fame career, and I think that's going to happen.
Let the Moose loose. Send the Moose to Cooperstown. That's all we're yelling around here. I'll be his biggest advocate. And, if I didn't get thrown out by the Orioles, I might have a Hall of Fame ballot by now, and then I could endure all the crap on the Internet, people yelling at me about either voting for or against Barry Bonds. I probably would not be a very good baseball ballot voter because I would not vote for Bonds. I would not vote for Sosa. I guess holding that, I probably wouldn't vote for A-Rod. And it's funny, I talked to Justin McGuire about this, Luke. I think A-Rod has done more to help his Hall of Fame candidacy by being the best television commentator of this generation. It's funny like that, right? Schilling has hurt his candidacy by running his mouth, and A-Rod has probably helped his candidacy by being this TV wonder kind, right?
Yeah, probably. Although I
shouldn't
don't
work
know.
that way, but I think it will. I think it will.
Yeah, I don't know if that will get him over the hump. I really don't know. I so struggle with what to do with PED users, with working under the understanding that there are already cheaters in the Hall of Fame, and we're still dealing with so many assumptions on so many of these guys. And look, I'm not going to sit here and say I don't think Barry Bonds took PEDs. I saw what everyone else saw. But at the same time, where do you draw that line between suspicion and an ironclad failed drug test like Manny Ramirez had? Where do you what do you do with that? And I think that's where I am empathetic to writers on how exactly to go about dealing with this, because ultimately at the end of the day, the Hall of Fame is a museum of the history of baseball, and how do you tell the history of baseball without guys like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and Alex Rodriguez? My goodness, you're talking about 3 of the all-time best players in the history of the game, and then go down the list of some other guys you can talk about. It's problematic. I'm not saying I like it. I'm not saying I have the perfect solution of what to do. I'd be inclined to vote for those guys, but I also would be inclined to note within the context of the Hall of Fame that there are players in the Hall of Fame that are less than ideal people from a character standpoint, and that's always been true. Go back and look at some of the individuals that are in there, from Ty Cobb to Cap Anson. Go down the list of individuals, and there's lots of debate as far as the character clause and trying to make those arguments for or against. But
they let Harold Baines in because he's a nice guy.
He was a really good hitter too, but let's acknowledge that. But it's just, at some point in time, I feel like writers are being asked to play God, and some take that in a negative direction, but I think for the most part, most of these writers are just struggling with that notion of trying to play God and figure out who exactly belongs and who doesn't. And, what do you do with a guy like David Ortiz in a few years? Who checks every box in terms of numbers, even as a DH, especially as we were talking about Edgar Martinez a few minutes ago, but, PED suspicions with him and I mean, how do you leave him out? And I know it's not a smoking gun in the same way of a Barry Bonds or a Manny Ramirez, but there was suspicion about him, certainly. And what do you do with him? I mean, are you going to leave him out? I'm guessing not. So if he's in, how do you leave those other guys out? I mean, it's such a rabbit hole. It's so problematic for me. I mean, it's such a Pandora's box situation where
well, it devalues the whole thing. I mean, the argument itself, and the more we argue it, it makes me just put my head in my hands and say, this doesn't matter to me in my life. It doesn't matter anymore. Where it used to really matter to me and, held it right here and near and close and my cousin in the Hall of Fame and all of that stuff. And, I'm a 50-year-old now, just like, just tell me who you like and where the popularity, when the prom begins, and we'll show up. You know what I mean?
And you know what? I think what you just said makes perfect sense. And even in the context of, you were just saying how you'll be happy when Mike Mussina gets in. To me, it becomes a very personal thing at some point in time that you just acknowledge that this thing isn't going to be perfect in the same way that baseball wasn't perfect for a very long time with PED use rampant. And, it's still existing to this day. I mean, we have drug tests and guys that fail drug tests. When you have guys that fail drug tests, that gives you more confidence that testing is actually working. Because if no one would ever fail a drug test, then you wonder if it's just a complete sham. So you're always going to have some of that. And you're going to have that in every sport to some degree, some scandal, some nefarious topic that's going to be discussed, whether it's gambling or drug use or off-the-field transgressions, whatever it might be. At the end of the day, as you said, it's a museum. I mean, that's really what it is, and we can put people in there that we don't necessarily feel very good about, and we can personally choose not to celebrate that person. I'm not going to do any cartwheels if and when Barry Bonds ever gets into the Hall of Fame, but how do you have a Hall of Fame without the all-time home run leader and the guy who even before, say, 1999, 2000, when this stuff began with him as far as suspicion, was already one of the top 20 or 25 players, position players in the history of the game at that point. So you can put them in, I think, eventually. I mean, and this is kind of my personal spin on it. And then it's up to the individual to kind of decide who you're going to celebrate. A guy like Mike Mussina, I'll absolutely celebrate being in the Hall of Fame, even if I see all the problems with the Hall of Fame, with the process, with Hall of Fame electees already, and with others that are still trying to get into Cooperstown. At the end of the day, it's something that we probably shouldn't lose sleep about, and we can choose to care about it with the individuals we like, and we can choose to just acknowledge it in passing and then move on with the individuals that we don't want to root for. And to me, that's how I kind of view the Hall of Fame. As I'm now in my mid-30s and I love baseball, but I fully acknowledge baseball is far from perfect.
All right, the Hall of Fame ceremonies will be the weekend of July 19, 2021, 22. So I guess I better hold that open if I'm going to go up and celebrate Mussina getting in. It would be that weekend. So there you have it. Or what we call it here in Baltimore, the weekend before Billy Joel brings everyone downtown. How about that?
And the weekend before training camp starts, I would assume. So it'll be an exciting time. We haven't talked too much about the 2019 Orioles, and I think there's probably a reason, good reason for that.
Well, look at the time, Luke. We're running out of time here.
I know, right. We'll have plenty of time to talk about this year's version of the Orioles, which not going to be pretty, but big picture-wise, I'm a little more encouraged than I was a few months ago, that's for sure.
After FanFest and sometime after we get back from Atlanta and Super Bowl 53, Luke Jones and I will begin to dissect the reclamation project of Team Elias and Team John and Lou Angelos. We'll get to all that and more. You can find us at thebuyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.